Good afternoon. Today, the Joint Subcommittee is meeting to discuss the state sales tax. Virginia has over 80 existing sales and use tax exemptions. Services are broadly exempt from the sales tax while consumption has significantly increased for services. I believe our sales tax base should be modernized to reflect actual consumption. Today's meeting should give us insight into our sales tax base, other states' treatment of services and digital goods, and potential consideration for session. We have some overviews, and I'd like to start by asking Kristen Collins, Deputy Commissioner for Virginia Department of Taxation, to please come forward with your presentation.
Anna Duncan, too.
And also Anna Duncan from Tax to present on our existing sales tax exemptions. Thank you. We're anxious to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Anna Duncan from the Tax Department. Okay. There we go. All right. The sales tax, the exemptions are divided into 8 broad categories. Those categories include governmental exemptions. Those are used to prevent unconstitutional taxation of the federal government and to prevent the state government from taxing itself. Commodities exemptions to avoid double taxation. Agricultural exemptions that prevent tax pyramiding, and commercial industrial exemptions that do the same. Service exemptions keep the sales tax on tangible personal property. Media-related exemptions encourage the use of Virginia businesses. Medical-related exemptions reduce the cost of medical necessities, and nonprofit exemptions reduce the cost of those providing assistance to the community. So, as Madam Chair said, there are currently 82 exemptions on the books. Of that, 21 of those were enacted back in 1966. Of the remaining, 11 of those exemptions, not including the ones for nonprofits, were enacted between 1966 and 1979. 22 were enacted in the 80s, 8 were enacted in the 90s, 10 in the 2000s, and then since 2010, there have been 13, and 3 of those previous exemptions have expired. Multi-fuel heating stoves, catalogs for orders under $100, and donated educational materials were the ones that have expired. General graph to show the creation of these exemptions in the code. All right, revenue impact. Most services are exempt from the Virginia retail sales and use tax. The cost of these exemptions is unknown because the department is not reported to the department. Dealers report the total number of exempt sales, but they do not segregate that by the exemption for the reason. And purchasers are not required to report exempt purchases. So the estimates that are included in this presentation are based on the U.S. Economic Census Report data. This provides details for more than 6,000 goods and services by category that can be broken out into 18 different industries. There are about 380 service categories or subcategories that have been identified as potential areas of interest, and they are selected by category industry combination. All right, on to personal services. This chart shows what the cost of this exemption is estimated to be. So if there were to be, for example, a decision to tax dry cleaning and laundry, that could potentially generate $19.9 million in the first fiscal year, moving up into the $22 million range, 23, and so forth. So this is a breakout of those different personal exemptions. We're going to look at some of them specifically, but this is a great resource for use. All right, neighboring states, the personal exemptions. Admissions, dry cleaning, laundry services, labor related to car repair and detailing are generally taxable across our neighboring states. That would be Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. These services are exempt in Maryland and in Virginia. Transportation charges are widely exempt, whereas delivery charges are taxable in North Carolina and in Tennessee. Hairdressing and nail care services are widely exempt across our neighboring states. Again, all of these personal services are exempt in Virginia. Business services. Again, if one of these areas were targeted to remove the exemption, this would be the estimated revenue that could be generated from that. Advertising, staffing, security, landscaping, travel agent services are all exempt in North Carolina and Tennessee. These services are all taxable in West Virginia. Staffing, security, and landscaping are taxable in DC, whereas travel agent services are not. And West Virginia is the only neighboring state, actually, that taxes travel agent services. Professional services. These include professional careers such as accounting, agriculture, healthcare, surveying, legal, veterinarians. They are widely exempt in Virginia and all the neighboring states, except for veterinary services in Kentucky regarding small animals, excuse me. Computer services, which is the any maintenance on the computer, anything on the hardware itself, that is taxable in Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, and DC, but exempt in Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. All right, additional sales tax exemptions for services include amounts separately charged for labor or services rendered in installing, applying, remodeling, or repairing property sold, amounts charged for labor or services in connection with the modification of pre-written computer programs, custom computer programs, amounts separately charged for diagnostic work on automotive repair and emergency roadside service, and charges for accommodations furnished to transients for more than 90 continuous days. All right, on to taxation of digital services. These are generally not taxable in Virginia. Examples of these services include digital downloads, streaming services, website hosting and design, and cloud-based services. Cloud-based services examples would include software as a service and data storage services. We're going to look into these categories more specifically. All right, digital downloads. This includes software, ebooks, music, videos. North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, and DC all levy sales tax on these digital downloads to some extent. They are exempt in Virginia and in West Virginia. The potential fiscal impact of taxing these items would be about $73.8 million in 2026 and onwards up to $130 million in 2031. States that tax digital downloads typically do so in two ways. The first is broadening the existing retail sales tax definition of tangible personal property to specifically include downloaded digital books, audio, visual type of property. Alternatively, you could expand, they expand the definition of tangible personal property to include any property in any manner perceptible to the senses. So that would widen the definition to potentially include many different things. The other option is to create an entirely new category of intangible property that would be subject to the retail sales and use tax, which would also include digital download goods. Most states typically choose to create a new category of intangible property, as it is believed that this method increases visibility and lessens the likelihood of ambiguity or taxpayer misunderstanding in its application. Streaming services are any services an online provider of entertainment delivers content over an internet connection to a subscriber's computer, TV, or mobile device. These are familiar services such as Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Spotify, Apple TV. All of our neighboring states levy a tax on streaming services. Most of those states choose to tax these services under the retail sales and use tax, but alternatively, it could be included under the communication sales and use tax, which has a narrower base, a lower rate, and is collected over a much smaller group of dealers. We have estimates for both the retail sales and the communication sales and use. For retail sales tax, if that were to be taxing streaming services, collect about $92 million in the first year, moving up to $126 million in 2023. The communication sales tax on streaming services would be $79 million in 2026, upwards to $109 million in 2031. Cloud-based services such as software as a service, this is generally referred to as SaaS, as well as digital data services and many others. SaaS is a cloud-based computing model in which general or specialized software applications are hosted by a vendor or a service provider and made available to customers over the internet. This service is taxable in Maryland, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and DC, but is exempt in North Carolina and in Virginia. Data storage service is a space in a data center on servers and equipment that can be directly connected to the internet for online secure support data backup. It is taxable in DC and exempt in all other neighboring states. Definitional considerations are paramount when considering how to tax cloud-based services. Options include taxing one or more broad categories of cloud-based services or any service that utilizes the cloud in order to ensure a moderately broad reach. Alternatively, it could maximize the reach of the new tax by levying tax on all services that utilize the cloud and then narrow the scope of that tax through specific exemptions. Some states that take a broad approach to taxing these services offer exemptions for data processing, information services, and the like. Sourcing issues. Virginia uses an origin-based sourcing, but destination sourcing is permitted in certain circumstances. The 2019 guidelines for remote sellers and market facilitators, Virginia expressly authorized market-place facilitators accepting and processing orders to Virginia customers through a website or electronic application to use destination-based sourcing if unable to associate the order with a physical place of business in Virginia. Sourcing the taxation of digital goods and services creates challenges because the seller may be out of state, the purchaser's location of use may be unknown or non-fixed. Sourcing approach taken by other states include Maryland, which allows the digital goods to be sourced to the origin if possible, or to the primary use address if known, or otherwise to the billing address of the purchaser. Georgia allows digital goods to be sourced to the address where the goods are first used if no origin sourcing or other destination sourcing method is applicable. And in North Carolina, they require sourcing of digital goods to the seller's location, otherwise to the purchaser's location if the goods are received there, or alternatively to a known address of the purchaser. These are our contacts, and I welcome any questions.
Any questions of the speaker? Senator Abbott.
Thanks, Madam Chair. On slide 17, when you were talking about streaming services, I was wondering, does cable TV from a local cable provider, is that taxable right now or is that untaxed?
For that day.
Yes, it is.
Is that the?
And the communication sales tax.
Okay. So, Madam Chair, if I could follow up. So if you have, say, HBO under, and you get it from your cable provider, is that taxed, but I get it streaming and then it's untaxed?
Your idea.
That's correct. If it comes through the cable provider, it would be taxed under the communication sales tax. But if it's streamed separately, then it would be not taxed right now.
Thank you.
Would you like to continue?
No,
Senator Abbott?
that's
Senator
completes my
Searle?
questions.
Yeah, I have one quick question. Madam Chair, quick question. So,
Acknowledge you.
I'm sorry. There you go.
There you
Okay. Your assumptions, I assume you did these projections, you assume the existing tax rate. Do any other states have differential tax rates based on different services? They all use the same rate, uniform across the board, do you know?
That's a great question. I'd have to look into it and get back to you.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Further questions? I'm surprised.
Oh.
Did a great job.
Hold on. Oh, delete.
Delegate Watts, I apologize, I did not see you in queue. Delegate Watts?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Actually, I only did request to speak after you said you were surprised that there were no questions. I think it's appropriate at this time that I beg the committee's and your understanding that after the presentation from the Tax Foundation, I was not aware of the agenda because my email got anyway, but the point is, I have slides that I prepared for NCSL on taxing services done this May following our action on telecommunications tax. And if I could possibly, at the end of the agenda, as a case example of taxing services and taxing digital, if I could walk through a couple of these slides that provide current information and current estimates that I worked through with tax department, again, back in a May 17th timeframe, I think it would add also to our considerations of what is potentially possible.
Okay, if we don't run over the next meeting that I'm supposed to be in, that'll be fine.
Thank you. I understand.
Further questions? Okay, now we're going to review of state sales tax and sales tax basis. And right now, our next speaker is going to be Andrew Yurskoff from Tax Foundation, and you will present on trends in other states and tax foundations, policy positions on guiding principles for an ideal sales tax. And I'm so interested in hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Andrei Yushkov. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Tax Foundation based in Washington, D.C. We are a
Could you pronounce your name again?
Andrei Yushkov.
Yushkov, I did get it. Thank you.
So we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank dealing with state policy at different levels of government, at the global level, at the federal level, and I'm responsible for covering state and local tax policy. So thank you for the opportunity to present before the subcommittee and talk about, different experiences of Virginia's neighbors and how Virginia compares with other states on sales tax rates and sales tax basis. So first, I would like to talk briefly about the sales tax landscape, and this was partly subject of the discussion last session, but just to illustrate some of the trends. So sales taxes, sales and use taxes are still a major source of revenue for state governments in the United States. In some states, some states rely more on individual income taxes, some states rely more on sales and use taxes, but still, on average, it is one of the two largest sources of revenue. Its share has slightly declined in recent years, mostly because of services and because services are not taxable in many states. That was the reason. And as a result of that, average state and local tax rates have increased over time. So, say the median sales tax rate in the 70s was 3%, in the 90s it was 5%, now it's 6%, and if you include state and local, it will be 7%. So again, this base narrowing led to higher sales tax rates over time. And services now occupy a much larger share of the economy and still not taxable in Virginia and in many of your competitors. So this graph illustrates precisely that. Again, there are different estimates about how large services are vis-a-vis goods. If you consider all, total consumption, then services now occupy 70% of total consumption. If you only consider potentially taxable consumption, then it will be still more than 50%. It's a huge increase compared to 50 years ago, when it was 30, and even lower when sales taxes started in the 30s. The share of consumption the share of services in consumption was about 25%. And again, to illustrate this tendency that I'm talking about, you can see this following graph. As I mentioned, right, median sales tax rates went up precisely because sales tax breadth went down. So the average sales tax breadth was about 54% in the 70s, now on average for all US states, and now it's about 37%. So you can see that the trend is clear. The base is getting narrower and narrower in most states, and the rate is.
Anyway, chocolate is very expensive.
Please mute.
Yeah, and this map, I didn't want to show you the entire map of the United States, but if you are interested, you can go to our website. Every year we update sales tax rates, individual and corporate income tax rates, so you can go and compare the entire country. But I just wanted to focus on, Virginia and its vicinity, its neighbors. And as you can see, the average state and local tax rate in Virginia is the lowest among its competitors. It's 557 if you include local sales taxes. But as you can see, it's higher in Maryland, although Maryland does not allow local option sales taxes because counties in Maryland rely on local income taxes. And the same in Kentucky. But all other states, they have the state component and the local component, but still the rates are much higher. And in Tennessee, it's on average 9.56, but Tennessee is a little different because they do not have an individual income tax. Reliance, so this is just one metric that we calculate, and the reliance on sales tax, as you know, it is also relatively low. According to our estimate, it's 21%. It can be even lower if you just divide, sales tax collections by total tax revenue, and it's much lower than in many of Virginia's neighbors. DC is probably an exception here, and Tennessee as well, because Tennessee does not rely on individual income tax. But all other states, Kentucky, Maryland, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, they all have a higher reliance on sales taxes than Virginia. And more importantly for this presentation, sales tax breadth that we also calculate annually, it is by far the lowest among Virginia's neighbors. And in general, it is the third lowest in the nation after only Massachusetts and California. So the sales tax breadth, essentially this is a metric that shows you what percentage of the economy is included in the sales tax base. And in Virginia, it's 24.7%, much lower again than in DC, Maryland, Tennessee, and all other neighbors. Now, a little bit about, sales tax reform is needed, and we have this sense from all the presentations today and in August. But I just wanted to share some very general principles of sales tax reform. Because, recently we worked with Kentucky, a couple of other states. They wanted to modernize their sales tax base. And we have now a clear vision on what the sales tax reform should look like. You can also go to our website and find a publication by my colleague Jared Wolzak. It is a guide for legislators, so you can find some additional information there. So the theory of public finance, it tells us that wage taxes and consumption taxes are theoretically equivalent. But of course, income taxes are not only wage taxes. So they include, as you know, in many states, interest, dividends, capital gains. And so income taxes can disincentivize saving and investing, unlike correctly designed sales taxes. And one study, again, you can go to the publication I referred to and check the review of the literature, but one study found that a 1% shift in tax revenue from income to consumption, including sales taxes, can increase GDP by 0.74% in the long run. So it can be growth inducing potentially. We believe that base broadening is generally sound tax policy, and it allows for lower rates or higher revenues if you need higher revenues, or if you need to substitute other sources of revenue with sales tax revenue. Our general understanding is that final consumption goods and services should ideally be taxed, but business inputs intermediate transaction, business-to-business transactions, they should, at least in the American system, because it is not a value-added system which many European countries use, but those should be tax exempt to avoid tax pyramiding. And we did some estimations for Kentucky, and tax pyramiding leads to higher effective tax rates. So consumers can still believe that they pay a 6% tax or 5% tax, but in fact they may pay a 10 or 12 or 15% effective tax rate, depending on the assumptions, depending on the industry. But tax pyramiding can be ubiquitous if you tax business-to-business transactions. There are some myths, and some groups believe that taxing business inputs can shift the tax burden from consumers to businesses, but effectively most businesses can shift this burden on to final consumers. And that taxing business inputs, it can lead to a tax base that is even broader than actual consumption in a given state. There are some risks of taxing business inputs that we discuss in detail in the publication. But generally, depending on the industry, we observe that taxing business inputs can lead to non-uniform effective tax rates, not statutory tax rates because those are well defined, but effective tax rates. As a result, the hidden true cost of government, so again, residents believe that they pay 6%, in fact, that they can have a much higher burden. It can influence the choice of production method. So it can incentivize firms in certain industries to vertically integrate. If most of their business inputs are taxed, then large firms, of course, will have incentives to vertically integrate. And for them, this will reduce the tax burden. But for smaller firms, unfortunately, it won't. So smaller firms will be subject to this increased burden of taxation that they will shift to final consumers. Also the sales tax in this case, it can shift from a purely consumption tax to a production tax. It will resemble, in a way, the gross receipts tax, which we believe is one of the most harmful ways of taxing corporations and in general. I will not stop here for a long time, but still, this graph shows you that if you don't exempt business inputs, then taxes will pyramid over the value cycle, and then consumers will face, again, a higher effective tax burden. Digital services, our colleagues from the Department of Taxation had a great presentation. Again, it's often challenging between all these categories that we were discussing today to differentiate B2B services from B2C services. So sometimes specialized expertise is needed, but the ways that state try to approach this problem, well, first of all, they try to limit the nature of the product. So to have an enumerated list of digital services included in the base, or to rely on the identity of the buyer. So if the buyer, say, self-reports that he or she or they are a consumer, then tax is applied. If it is a non-profit or a business, then the tax is not applied. So there are different models of that. But a couple more slides on the sales tax base, and I hope it will be helpful. Again, our colleagues presented most of these services, but we have these tables that provide a clear classification of what is taxable and what is not taxable in Virginia and all the neighboring states plus Pennsylvania. And so you can see that this is the list of final consumption goods. It does not include digital goods and services. They are on the next slide. These are sort of traditional services, right? And you can see that, and you all know that Virginia doesn't tax or exempt all these consumption services, but recent trends show that many states, including Kentucky, including North Carolina, Tennessee, they started taxing more and more final consumption goods and services. And you can see here that, for instance, parking, dry cleaning, jewelry services, over-the-counter drugs, they become taxable in more and more states. For some reason, in the neighboring states, barber services are still not taxable, and it's also not clear why, because, say, if you buy shampoo is taxable, but your haircut isn't, and there is no clear reason of why it is non-taxable. In some states, it's already taxable, but not in Virginia's neighbors. Now, if we look at digital goods and services, again, a great presentation by our colleagues, but here you can see that some states, when it comes to final consumption, digital goods and services, including smartphone apps, streaming services that were mentioned today, digital audio-visual works, ebooks, they are taxable in most states, in Maryland, in DC, in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania. Ringtones as well, they are much less relevant these days, but they are also taxable in most states. Now, business inputs, well, we believe that Virginia is currently a good example of the state that doesn't tax many business inputs, many digital business inputs as well. But as you can see, most states, well, they either exempt or have a mixed treatment of manufacturing machinery, manufacturing raw materials. Most states do tax office equipment because it's pretty hard to distinguish office equipment from, furniture that you buy for your home. Farm equipment is also non-taxable in most states. And all these new services, well, there is a problem with some of them. For instance, platform as a service, this is, again, related to cloud computing. And this is tricky because there is no clear guidance on platform as a service in Maryland, in West Virginia, in Kentucky. But in some states, these services are not taxable. And payroll services are also not taxable in most states because they are clearly a business input. So consumers do not use payroll services just for fun. And to conclude, I just wanted to briefly mention that there were several recent relatively large-scale reforms in Kentucky. And Kentucky now, for instance, has an enumerated list of personal services included in the base, landscaping, veterinary services, fitness, dry cleaning. And as a result, we recently did a presentation in Indiana and compared to Indiana, Kentucky's revenues over the last 6 years, real revenues, so adjusted for inflation, from the sales tax, they went up by 33%, and Indiana's revenues went up only by 10% because Indiana didn't implement any reforms in that area. So as you can see, the inclusion of some of the personal consumption services in the base can lead to base broadening and can lead to higher revenues for the state. Other states include Utah, where there is now an exemption for machinery and equipment, again, business input. In Iowa, they exempt digital products based on purchaser's identity. So if the purchaser is a business, then most digital products are exempt. If it is a final consumer, then they are taxable. And North Carolina, for instance, included some additional services, installation, repair, maintenance, in the base as well. So I'll stop here, but I'll be happy to take questions.
There are questions. Senator Searle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So back on slide 8, you said that Virginia's sales tax breadth is the third lowest in America after Massachusetts and California, right? Mm-hmm. Do you have any data that shows where we were, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago, trying to understand whether we've slid to third from last for failure to act or whether we've just kind of always been there?
Yeah, so John Mikesell from Indiana University has calculated sales tax breadth for decades. So you can find, and I'll be happy to send some numbers from his publication because he has data from the year 2000. And I believe Virginia's sales tax breadth was a little higher, but not significantly higher. So it still was below 30%. And it was still one of the lowest. So it went down a little bit more, but it was already pretty low compared to other states in 2000 and even before that.
The second question, Madam Chair. Thanks. That would be helpful data. I understand what you said about us being around 30%. I'm just trying to understand whether other states have gone past us or whether we're in the same place in the pack or what. Because if everybody else is doing stuff and we're not, that says a lot more to me than if we've just always been there. My second question was, you talked about this pyramiding thing, and on slide 11 you said business inputs and B2B transactions as a general principle should be tax exempt to avoid tax pyramiding. So I'm trying to understand why that's a general principle, why that, and what's wrong with pyramiding. I understand that, I guess pyramiding is the idea that if you start taxing business to business, the tax grows as it moves down the chain, the amount of taxes being paid. But I'm not clear why that's bad. So I'm trying to understand.
From our perspective, that's bad because it is much less transparent than other forms of corporate taxation, for instance. So if your priority is to tax corporations more, then there are more transparent ways to do that, for instance, through the corporate income tax. Because here, again, it will be much less transparent because final consumers, they will still be subject to this retail sales tax, but they won't know exactly what their burden is, right? So this is, in a way, much less transparent if you talk about, transparency with respect to final consumers.
Madam Chair, can I follow up on that?
Continue, Senator Serval.
Thanks. I took a trip to Taiwan about, 14 years ago as part of the Taiwanese government had us go over there, and we toured this Palm Pilot factory, and somebody asked the owner of the plant whether the tax rate, the corporate income tax rate, played a role in his decision to locate there. And the CEO, owner of the company, thought that was hilarious because he said, in order to pay an income tax, that means you have to be making money, which he wasn't making any money. And so a corporate income tax is something you only pay if you're earning a profit, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So if you'd had a sales tax that pyramided or whatever, you would still be collecting taxes, whether or not they were running the business well or not, right? So I mean, why is it a bad thing? Do you liken this pyramiding thing to a gross receipts tax? Is that why you guys don't like it? I mean, is it just a transparency thing or what?
Yes,
understand.
So because essentially it will be very similar to the gross receipts tax, and gross receipts tax, as you correctly mentioned, it doesn't depend on the profitability. And firms that specifically during periods of crisis that experience lower profitability or negative profitability, they will still be subject to a gross receipts tax, and they will still be subject to to this tax, business inputs tax. And this can potentially lead during periods of crisis to, detrimental consequences for many businesses that just cannot survive because they need to keep prices at a particular level, but then, their markup is relatively low compared to what they pay in business inputs taxes. Well, again, this depends on the extent of business input taxation, because if only a few business inputs are taxed, that's relatively minor. But if most of them are taxed, then this is exactly the gross receipts tax that many states avoid, and for a good reason.
Okay, thanks.
Delegate Suckles and Delegate McNamara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but we have two what I consider really bad anti-economic development taxes, the BPOL tax, where you tax people when they're not making money, as we just discussed, and also the machinery and tools tax that some jurisdictions have that have allegedly, I believe, is a impediment to economic development. Do you have any views on those things? And what I'm thinking here is that you would want to replace some of the suggestions you have here if we could figure out how to make local governments whole. Those are both local government taxes that are bad.
Yeah, so these are local government taxes, so they're not statewide gross receipts taxes, especially the first one. But still, our general view on gross receipts taxes is that they should ideally be replaced with a corporate income tax, because this is a tax on average profitability. Again, thinking about different ways of generating revenues for local governments, well, local sales tax is one option, right? If you expand the base, and the base is uniform in Virginia, then localities will automatically benefit from that from the revenue perspective, and you can potentially substitute some of these taxes with just the expanded sales tax. This would be one way. And many states do that currently. States that allow a local option sales tax, they allow localities to increase their local sales taxes, or we observe that they localities benefit from the expansion of the sales tax base, for sure.
Delegate McNamara?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I go back to slide 6, I just have to issue a word of caution. When I look at this, it portrays Virginia as certainly having a lower average state and average local sales tax rate. I might diverge and say thank you to the Tax Foundation. I really enjoy your annual report, and it is fantastic to try to understand where we sit. My concern with charts like this, and you can make me feel better maybe, is it's presenting data in a vacuum. So specifically, if I look at the states on this chart, it looks we are much lower on state and average local sales tax. But when you talk about what Delegate Sickles talked about, gross receipt tax or B-poll tax, there's not a single state on here that has a gross receipt tax. When you talk about income tax, there is one state on here that has an income tax as high as ours. Some of them are zero. Tennessee is zero. So I think when we look at this, I believe this is looking at things out of context, because we're not looking at our total tax system. And when we look at things like restaurant and food service that are not being taxed, well, I can go to Bristol, Virginia, and there's a 10% tax on a hamburger. So I don't believe that happens in Pennsylvania or Maryland or North Carolina or West Virginia. So maybe you can make me feel better about this chart.
No, that's very helpful, Delegate. And, we have this problem, which many states talk about. And by the way, Tennessee has a gross receipts tax as well. It's pretty low, but they still have it. But we have this problem. Today, we released our new state tax competitiveness index. And there, we now treat corporate income taxes as a completely different system from a gross receipts tax system, because they're not comparable, and we are still trying to find ways, to match the two and to calculate the total, say, corporate income tax burden. But we are still in the process, but we are conducting this research. With respect to restaurant taxes, yes, we have a new publication on that, comparing meals taxes in 50 largest U.S. cities, and you can see that Virginia Beach is one of them. It's actually number 3 with 11.5%. So yes, this is another concern, that restaurant taxes are pretty high, and they are called restaurant taxes or meals taxes, but they apply to prepared food in general. And if people, say, dine out and Whole Foods, they still pay this 11% tax in Alexandria or 11.5% in Virginia Beach. And food is not taxable. So you can see that there is this non-neutrality in the system between different types of food. And but we have the publication on restaurant meals taxes, a separate one. And within our index, we assess gross receipts. So you can go and compare Virginia with some other states. But the problem is that in Virginia, it's a local tax. So we don't include it in some of those publications because we consider statewide taxes. But rest assured, I mean, we are still working on this equivalence between corporate income taxes and gross receipts taxes.
You're welcome. Delegate Watts, I see you in queue, and I know you have a presentation you'd like to make. So in the interest of time, if you could go on and just give us kind of introduce your information, and then we could go through the details of it with your slides at another meeting.
Yes, I think that would be excellent. I'm sorry that we weren't able to coordinate ahead of time because what I am passing out copies of, which were just reproduced by staff when I arrived here today and saw the agenda, is the presentation that I made on May 17th to NCSL on what had happened on our digital taxation. But what it contained, the 8 slides that I have reproduced on the handout for you, what it also contains is when COVID hit, I realized that we were dependent on 70% of our general fund was dependent upon the income tax, which as indicated is an over-reliance on one form of taxation. And the big problem that I saw almost immediately was pointed out by the Tax Foundation that we have such a narrow tax base and retail sales tax base, and knowing that JLARC way back in 2002, I think it was, perhaps it's 12, pointed out that in 1970, the amount that the average household spends on services versus goods began growing, and it's now more than 2 to 1. So in the interest of progressivity, I also took a look at that. I have put in the bill at least twice to get a fiscal impact statement. And the numbers before you that you see are based upon the fact that I put in the bill in the last session, and working with tax department, you can see the sites on that first slide say that I'm working from the fiscal impact statement, the Excel spreadsheets behind that fiscal impact statement to be able to give apples and apples comparison of what might happen in Virginia if we were to go on. And you can see I walked through what we were dealing with in the budget of the digital as proposed by the governor, the digital as acted upon in the budget action as far as business to business issue, and what the numbers were there for FY 26. And then, and I would note on that one quick thing on slide 4, look at the there's a footnote there that is very important. It's a New York tax ruling that says if you have software that has not been customized at all, it is a digital good. It's a tangible rather than intangible business service, and that's an important distinction in the precedent of tax law. And you will also note on that same slide the citation of the 2 places in the code, whereas commodities, we exempt manufacturing and agricultural from pyramiding, but we don't do it as far as, for example, what Tax Foundation just pointed out on this chart. Everyone, when you go into Office Depot for the pencils and the computer and it's not tax exempt just because you say I'm a business, because administratively it becomes extremely difficult to administer, and this is why you see the fact that most states tax office equipment, office supplies as tangible services, and again, digital comes under that. But then I would point you then to the next slides, where on number 6, you will see, as I've worked through again and again, the whole issue of what are if you're going to tax services, what would be the logics on what you tax. And so these are my thoughts on it, on again footnotes, healthcare, anything that has to be licensed. So if you have a massage therapist, there's no tax on that service. But if it's a masseuse in the spa, then that is a personal service that would be taxed. Another essential service that I'm excluding is all professional services. I'm assuming that if you get a divorce or you buy the house, you need to have that professional service. The same thing as far as architectural and so on. The next one is the business to business that I just mentioned, so that if you have your maintenance that you're contracting for within the business and the lawn service, et cetera, building trades, if you need to have a permit for what the tradesman is doing in your house, then that becomes that is excluded, because it's essential that you have that quality of service. But if he's just repairing the ice box or the plumbing, that's another thing, and then home and ground service again, administratively, it would be very difficult to, and you wouldn't want to do arm's length types of transactions, but if you're dealing with somebody who is a tax agent, that is where I'm clicking there. Notice then on 7, there's 2 important charts, and then I'll wrap up. Number 7 gives you proportionately, as one bar after another, the consumer digital as first proposed by the governor. The next bar is the consumer digital plus the apps, and then the next bar is the digital as part of total consumer services as I looked at the dollars that working through with the tax department. And I find it to be particularly interesting as you look at 8, which is why I wanted to have this, if you will, case study out at this point, that the dollar figures that we're looking at of over $2 billion total, that was $2.3 billion for FY26. Notice how it splits out, that 38% of that $2.6 billion would be in the state general fund, 23% would be in local sales tax as you broaden the base, 16% of it would be allocated to localities based on school-age population, 14% of it would be the half cent that we have on transportation. 7% would be the regional transportation taxes that are sales taxes. And then finally, there are a couple of voter-approved local sales tax that would also benefit from that broadening. So I wanted to give this at this point so you see the case history of any part of or all of the above and how it might play out as far as how we approach the issue. And I'm looking at the time, it's now 2:59.
Yes, I'm going to turn to my director, April Keys.
Madam Chair, we are having comments and questions from the audience regarding the slides, so it would be my suggestion that we post, even though it's not something that was on the agenda, that we would go ahead and post the handout so that the audience has access to
please
it.
do.
No problem. I will be able to give that to you digitally tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have now we're at the point where we want to have a discussion of the 2024 session final fiscal impact, and I'd like to ask committee staff to present on revenue impacts of legislation referred to the joint subcommittee. And I would stress that many of these bills have significant negative revenue impacts, and some are dependent on congressional actions, as you might imagine. My preference is for patrons to refile their bills for the 2025 session if they want them to be reconsidered. Bills with large revenue impacts must be evaluated against the revenue outlook and other budget priorities before we move forward. So with that, I'd like to now turn to staff. Tyler? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like you mentioned, most of the bills have some sort of negative revenue impact, but there are a few that generate revenue. They're broadly listed by categories. So the first categories are the governor's proposed tax package that he proposed at the beginning of session this year, related to the income tax, increasing the state sales tax rate, and then broadening the sales tax base. The next group are the expansion of the sales tax base. Delegate Watts covered what was in her bill, and those things would generate revenue. Madam Chair, you had a bill that would include streaming and digital personal property in the sales tax base, generating revenue. There's the sunset provisions related to the standard deduction, which would expire at the end of tax year 2025. The revenue impacts are assumed in the forecast, but some of the revenue portions from the TCJA are dependent on extension that Virginia's benefited from. And then you see that there are creation of new brackets at the highest end. The first one would be a 7% bracket for 600,000 income above 600,000, and then a 10% for income over $1 million. Turning to the next slide, the other bills referred related to rolling conformity. Rolling conformity, you've passed, but it's based on federal tax changes, and so you could have a revenue loss or gain of $75 million before you stop conforming to certain federal provisions. There was legislation referred related to exemption of pension income for first responders from income tax, similar to what you've done to the military benefits for firefighters, and then a $10,000 deduction for state police retirement. There were several tax credit pieces: the child tax credit, the family caregiver, a low-income taxpayer tax credit, housing opportunity, and then content manufacturing. Turning to the last slide, there were several miscellaneous bills. One would reinstate the estate tax. Delegate Fowler's bill is similar to the governor's bill that would reduce the income tax and then add certain things into the sales tax base and then increase the rate. There's a bill related to the sales and use tax exemption for data centers that would require data centers to meet energy efficiency standards. And then there were two bills, one bill related to the corporate income and distribution of that revenue, and then one related to the contributions to college saving plans and the tax credit for that.
Thank you for that presentation, Tyler. Would there be any questions? I see Mr. Chairman on the monitor over there, so, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Torian?
Yes, ma'am, Madam President.
I could see you on the monitor. I was just curious as to whether or not you had any questions or any comments you'd like to make?
Just good afternoon, everyone. Madam Chair, I have no comments at this time.
Thank you. Anyone from the committee have any questions of staff? Did a good job, Tyler. I want to turn to our director.
We're done, Madam Chair.
Okay, it looks like we're done and we're in time for the next meeting. So if there are no further questions, and of course we have no further presentation, the committee will rise.
The Senate of Virginia.